Hi. As Delve League approaches in a few days, something I've been thinking a lot about is how Path of Exile has evolved over the course of its life. In particular, how it's evolved with respect to how you make skills behave. The very first trailer I saw of Path of Exile was the trailer where they showed the various different ways that you could modify the behavior of the Fireball skill using support gems. And that was the trailer that hooked me. That was the idea that I really thought made Path of Exile the unique and fascinating thing. That I could take these very basic unitary skills and through stacking almost bits of behavioral Lego, turn them into all kinds of strange and interesting variants. Now, this is not to say that Path of Exile has actually evolved is in any sense a boring game. I've played far more than I should have. I've played probably 5,000 hours of Path of Exile. I've made hundreds of builds, and I've had a really fantastic time with the game. But broadly, much of what I have been, and I think many players have been focused on in the end, is the internal mechanical structure of Path of Exile, rather than the more obvious behavioral elements of how the skills and support gems interact. I think the easier way to conceive of this is when you look at many endgame builds, they are powerful and unique mainly through the types of conversions, support gems, and internal interactions with ascendancies in the skill tree that produce the extraordinary damage outputs that they possess. Whereas you very rarely see an endgame build where someone turns up and shows you a really unusual combination of support gems to produce extraordinary behavior, barring a few really great things like worm blasters that everyone enjoys. And so I thought I would idly muse on the possible things that the game could do to build on what it already has, to produce or to maybe bring back some of that core concept. So the thing that really struck me about this was some time ago I was thinking, could I produce a skill that works like Frozen Orb from Diablo 2? So Frozen Orb, for those who don't know, is you fire a projectile and then it emits a number of smaller sub-projectiles. And this is the kind of thing that you could very much conceive of existing in Path of Exile, right? You could imagine a projectile emitter gem that moves far along and shoots sub-projectiles. But that's not really something that's in the game at the moment. In fact, broadly, when I think about how projectiles work, most of the time with projectiles, your basic goal is to cover as much of the screen as possible, and usually this is achieved through some combination of Pierce and GMP, or some slightly unfortunate choices of threshold jewels that I still think are a mistake. So how could we think of this going ahead? So the first and most obvious thing, to me it seems, is that I would love to see some more support gems that are like some of those that were existing early on in the game. Things like cast on melee kill, cast on critical strike, sort of elemental proliferation. The older gems where it seemed broadly the idea was you'd be constructing your skill through that, a few other gems, and you'd produce an unusual behavior, right? So you kill an enemy and produce a frost nova, and that would be how you get AoE. Some of what's actually happened in the game is that this kind of element has been introduced through some combination of uniques, and actually one of the things I'm quite excited about is the way heralds have come to be this. So for example, there are not that many there aren't many exclusively herald-focused builds, but heralds do add an extra bit of behavior onto almost any skill you care to name. I remember with great fondness the Worm Blaster Herald of Fire build before the double dipping was crushed. But I do think there's lots of room for extra kinds of support gems that we haven't really seen in the game, especially when we consider how limited the customization is for certain categories of skills. By far the most fleshed out category of skills in Path of Exile is projectiles. And there's an obvious reason for this, right? Projectiles are conceptually very easy to make behave differently. So for example, if I have Fireball, no, there's Fireball. Here's my Fireball. So I could add more projectiles. I could make those projectiles fork. I could make those projectiles slower. And I have something a bit different, right? And this has actually been a kind of slightly almost dominant element, where when you look at how the skills have actually ended up behaving, projectile skills are by far and away, very often, the choice if you can get hold of them. Whereas if we look at something like poor old Ice Nova, the types of scaling that you can do with Ice Nova are much more limited. With Ice Nova, you can perhaps give it Spell Echo, you could give it increased area of effect, but beyond that, it's very difficult to make the Ice Nova skill itself behave in a particularly unusual or strange way. And even within the projectile class, when we look at these, broadly speaking, these projectile modifiers don't really run the gamut of what projectiles could do. For example, there's no ability to make projectiles behave in anything other than a linear fashion. Projectiles head outwards. You can't make projectiles spiral, you can't make them curve, you can't make them bounce, you can't make them home. And this to me suggests that there's still lots of fascinating room to produce tons and tons of really interesting support gems that would open up the space for making skills that are really expressive. Even with something like Ice Nova, we could conceive of what kinds of things we could add to Ice Nova. And one of the reasons I think that we should focus on support gems, and a support gem that I have been particularly enjoying recently, is the Summon Phantasm on Kill support gem. So I've done a lot of Summon Phantasm on Kill builds. In fact, I've done far too many. And one of the reasons that I so enjoy it is that it completely changes how you use the skill with it. So because Summon Phantasm on Kill is a minion that casts a spell, and it has a projectile spell, right? So you can see these, at the moment, they're just doing that, right? They're just producing that little thing. But you can do some really fun things with Phantasms. I don't necessarily mean that these have been extraordinarily good builds, but they have often been very, very fun. So, for example, if I stick faster projectiles, where are you hanging out, faster projectiles, into this Inner Sire of Shards, is something that I quite enjoyed, you get a really strange and unusual bunch of little summons who now hang around producing these beautiful black rings of death. And there are many things coming in the next league that I think are going to be interesting on this front, in particular things like Herald of Agony. But my real hope is that we can go back and visit some of the support gems and add a bunch more. So why do I think there's so much room? Well, one way to think about it is, if you have a skill in Path of Exile, there are several different ways you can make it behave differently. At the moment, you can't really change a skill's behavior through time, unless it's a duration skill. So I can't make my Fireball skill be delayed in any sense. I can't change the facing of the projectiles once they're produced. I can't make it sensitive to player context in any significant sense. And I can't make it significantly worry about what enemies are doing, other than perhaps if I were to give it Immolate, and in that case it does something slightly different if they're on fire. So what do I mean by context? Well, in a lot of games, you have player states that skills are sensitive to. And a version of this in Path of Exile would be skills that are sensitive to, for example, charges. One of the interesting things about Path of Exile is that my impression was always that the charge system was going to evolve into a secondary resource system. You would have a lot of builds that would be relying on charges, and they would use and spend them in various interesting ways. And there are a few builds like that. I mean, Discharge comes to mind, although it's not that trendy anymore. But broadly speaking, my feeling is that almost all builds that substantially use charges either use them for their passive benefits, not particularly interested in building and spending them, or they use what I would describe as honestly fairly degenerate methods of generating charges. For example, the way that Juggernauts can generate infinite endurance charges, and the way that you can get a very large number of power charges if you want to, means that you can't really have very powerful things linked to the spending of charges, because simply put, if you did that, the player would be able to circumvent it too easily. So what's fascinating about the new Herald of Agony is that it does in fact have a secondary resource. This is the Virulence system. And I think that there are lots of bits of space where you could imagine taking skills and giving them the ability to generate or spend various different kinds of resource. And this is a kind of gameplay that you do see in other action RPGs. Not to say that this is necessarily how Path of Exile is proceeding in terms of copying them, but it is something that changes how you want to play your character. I mean, a classic example of this would be the way that, for example, Demon Hunters in Diablo 3 have both hatred and discipline, and they have to manage those resources, well, roughly manage those resources in how they play. But it goes a little bit further than that, because something else that's interesting about Path of Exile is, broadly speaking, you're not very sensitive to what the state of enemies is. There are a small number of things that do special things when you hit an enemy with certain things. I mean, Immolate is the classic example. But there certainly aren't support gems that allow you to replicate the behavior of skills like Elemental Hit. So Elemental Hit has the production of elemental novas of a quite sizable size when you strike an enemy that's afflicted by a particular status effect. That, to me, is the fascinating basis for a series of support gems that could also really begin to help out the fundamental problem with single-target melee skills. And the problem for me with single-target melee skills in Path of Exile is that there's really not much of a way to make them behave super differently. I mean, obviously you have multi-strike, which makes them attack very fast, or you can sock it in, I don't know, well, pretty much Ancestral Call and Melee Splash if you're doing a single target thing. But beyond that, because you're basically just selecting a point around the player, it's fairly limited in what you can do with them. But if you could make them scale in a way where, and this is where I think Cast on Malika was a really interesting direction that we could have gone, using mechanics that are already in the game, such as the conditional elemental novas, I mean, you can even imagine mechanics like cast on stun or various other things, giving parts of skills that already exist in the form of support gems, not to make those skills redundant, but simply because the more flexibility you have in slotting together these pieces of behavior, the more interesting your character can end up being. Something about the new skill Scourge Arrow is that Scourge Arrow drops these really cool little spore pods. I was instantly, I was just thinking, this would be such a cool support gem. Chance to proc a spore pod, whether it's on kill or hit, because that spore pod is in and of itself quite an interesting little thing, right? It shoots projectiles, and then suddenly you have a skill that might not be that interesting. You can turn it into a projectile spawner. I would love it if something that was seriously considered and began to be put back into the game were behavioral support gems that produced really unusual, strange, interesting effects. Something that I also think is a little bit disconcerting about how the game has evolved is the sheer proliferation of percentage more multiplier support gems. Now, this is not to say that this has necessarily produced an ultimately boring game, although it has rather limited your choice of how you build certain characters, in particular melee characters that are doing elemental conversion. When you look at the support gems they run, it tends to be very, very similar. I mean, there's a little bit of variation in how the underlying skill mechanic works, for example, Blade Flurry versus Heavy Strike or something, but you very rarely see someone's build and go, oh, that's a really unusual set of support gems they've chosen. I suspect, probably, and this is my feeling in the long run, the power of screen-filling projectiles and some of those more multiplier things needs to be gently reduced so that slightly more, should we say, off-kilter or unusual support gem setups become competitive. Because one of the central problems of having these very, very powerful multipliers in the support gem system itself is that they give you a massive problem of opportunity cost. If I want to use, I mean, because Fork, for example, is a really fun and cool skill gem. Like, I really like how Fork makes skills behave. The problem with Fork is it's just not very competitive with almost any other option that you have to make your projectiles behave. And what this means is that even people who would really want to make a character that has these strange forking skills, it's just very rarely worth your time. And when you look at things like GMP, which is now in its new state such a minor downside for the upside you get, which is the ability to cover the whole screen. And so many skills have so many built-in mechanics and so much built-in AoE that you very rarely need more than GMP on a projectile skill to make it viable for complete screen obliteration. And this is partly related to how much damage is scaled as well, which is perhaps another thing that might be addressed in the future. I really do feel like we could begin to bring back that element of skill construction. Now, a very fair response to this is that actually the game has quite a lot of interesting bits of behavior that you can get when you consider ascendancies and unique items. And this is absolutely true, and I'm really glad they're adding new uniques. For example, the staff that has Summer Phantasm on Kill built in, that actually I think is a really cool item, and I've got tons of stuff planned for it, the new Tyrant's Helm and so on, that to me opens up a bunch of really cool hybrid builds. But the problem with those items, or relying that much on the sort of quite high-level systems in the game to produce this kind of behavioral opportunity, is that especially for players who are starting or for players who maybe aren't that experienced, this support gem system is to them the primary customization system that they're going to be exposed to. And when they see all these support gems, this gives them an immediate upfront list of possibilities that they can consider when designing their character. And I think that a lot of stuff that is at the moment confined to uniques could also be placed onto could be put back into support gems, and maybe from some of the newer skills also into support gems. For example, I would love it if I could get the Nova quality of Sire Shards in a support gem. And you might say, but doesn't that make Sire Shards pointless? Well, not if you do it right. Partly because Sire Shards gives you both the Nova and additional properties for free. Which means, there are a lot of these, there are plenty of cases where the game has slightly redundant uniques that give you something that you can get somewhere else, but in a more guaranteed and easy to get fashion, especially in a more deterministic way if you're in SSF, for example. It's much easier to farm a Sire of Shards than possibly to build some other combination of things. The other thing I think that we could definitely really consider is, like I was saying earlier, the beginning of construction of internal economies. And this phrase seems slightly pretentious even. But when I say economies, what I mean is I want to be sitting here and thinking, might I have to manage some kind of resource so that I can design my character in more than simply, this is my main DPS skill that shits everything on the screen. I have something that builds and then spends. Tension and then release. This is such a core concept in so many other games, and I really like it. I mean, it isn't just a feature of like more advanced action games. It's a feat, you see it all over the place. For example, a support gem that allows you to spend some resource, well, sorry, a support gem that gives a skill a cooldown and then allows you to spend some kind of resource to bypass that cooldown with the side effect of making a skill more powerful. Or even support gems with enormous mana multipliers. Something that to me is a slightly missed trick is that mana at the moment in Path of Exile is a fairly dead mechanic. Broadly speaking, unless you're doing a small number of builds that have specific interest in mana, for example, Indigon, your interaction with mana is, how can I make my character in such a way that I can ignore it as a limitation? What I would love to see is support gems, with something like a 700% mana multiplier, or support gems that make a skill expend all your mana at the same time for massive returns depending on how much you have. Give the player the opportunity to opt in to a more resource management style of play, rather than very much the DPS focused style that is excellent at the moment. Something else that I think, when you look at what's coming, is going to be opened up is with the new instant skill system. It becomes a lot more possible to have builds that have more skills with, let's say, less friction. 3 years ago, I felt like Path of Exile was becoming very, very one button. And something I've really been pleased to see is how many new builds that people are coming up with that use a lot more buttons. And partly this has been to do with the addition of more utility skills and a further consideration of how you might make those utility skills good. And I think it's a really great direction to go in, although obviously you could go too far and make every character a fiesta of buttons. But I would absolutely love to see not only more utility skills, but more ability to turn existing skills into utility skills. Something I always found interesting was the freeze mine modifier that says something along the lines of, this skill freezes as if it did a lot more damage. Imagine if you could convert Ice Nova into, say, a almost zero damage dealing but massive freeze utility skill. At the moment that's not really possible. When you look at the downsides of a lot of the gems, they have become so minor and eroded that, for example, if I wanted to make a build that did almost no hit damage and massive damage over time, with a few exceptions of things where you go Quill Rain and a few other things, but even it's very difficult to do. Your hit damage is so hard to scale down. I would love to have all these different ways of making my character feel different. Now, this might sound like a bunch of complaining, and I mean, obviously in some sense it is, but I love this game so much, and I played so much of it, that I would really love to see the opening up of new vistas of skill combinations, support gems, and a real reinvigoration of the idea of the game as being you slotting together a bunch of behavioral Lego to produce a really strange and unusual set of things. Anyway, thanks for staying around for this extremely exciting ramble, and I'll see you in Delph.